I just want to mention that in addition to, she has a wealth of experience, and while she's the executive director of the Federal Chief Human Capital Officers Council, prior to that, she was the director of the Human Capital Management Office in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And there she managed the Defense Civilian Intelligence Personnel System for 60,000 intelligence civilians. So she really has walked the walk. And in that position, she also led the first major performance management reform pilot in over a decade. So performance management is something that Sarah has deep experience in. The Trump administration has proposed some major civil service reforms, including pay for performance, reskilling and upskilling the workforce, streamlining the hiring and removal processes. These are all tremendously difficult, challenging reforms. And human capital officers, of course, play a critical role in all of these things. So, Sarah, I want to start by asking you, what's the role of the Chief Human Capital Officers Council in this context?
Well, thank you very much. The Chief Human Capital Officers Council, CHICO we call it, was established in 2002. It's an interagency council which advises OPM and OMB on any of the policies that are currently under development. We represent 24 agencies plus OMB, as well as ODNI and the small agency HR councils. It's most people associate it with OPM. It situates over at OPM, but it's not owned by OPM. We are a little bit of the honest broker trying to make sure that the policies, excuse me, being proposed by the administration can be implemented at the agency level. And so we provide a very significant advisory role.
So one of the most interesting aspects of the President's budget proposal that was released involved the performance pay fund. It's $1 billion for 2019, an extra $50 million thrown in for 2018, as I understand it. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think it's one of the most exciting things about the President's budget. It recognized that there are a number of innovations being proposed across a variety of different agencies, whether they're doing pilot programs, whether they're trying to do pay banding, if they want to go into a pass-fail, if they are going to emphasis on cash awards. So it's a recognition that there is a different way to manage performance from the traditional automatic step increase process. And so I think that it gives the agencies and the CHICOs in particular a great opportunity to come forward with very forward-leaning ideas. There's a pot of money to fund the development of those, so I think it's a good thing.
So that pot of money is not just to dole out performance bonuses?
No, and I think one of the things we want to work hard is to not default to using systems we're used to, but to try to do more along the idea of pilots and innovations, tools that different organizations have been trying. I mean, you heard this morning from NGA where they've had pay for performance for a long time. You have pay for performance in your senior executive corps. Then you have organizations that are pass-fail. They're still managing performance in those scenarios, and this is an opportunity to open that dialogue.
So how will agencies access this fund? Is there an application process?
Well, I think the way, and again, this is pre-decisional, so I don't know exactly how they're planning to do it. I just know that OPM and OMB are currently working on the mechanics of what the application process would be, what would be some of the parameters of a successful or a positive fund for each agency. But every agency is not going to do the same approach.
So you have long experience in government. You've seen different performance models. What models are out there within government and possibly within the private sector that you've worked with that you think offer some opportunity or insight for agencies across government?
So this is one of my favorite stories. When I was much younger and I worked on Capitol Hill, I was frequently called out to make speeches for constituencies like this. And I had gone to one with a bunch of INSCOM attorneys from the Department of Army. And I was real nervous, and I was young, so I was trying to look mature. And so I wore my hair up really tight, and I had this French braid. It was back when that was a really big deal. And so I'm in the ladies' room getting ready for the speech, and this woman comes in, and she just goes ham on my hair. She just says, "Oh my gosh, your hair is so beautiful, all those highlights." And she went on and on about it, and then she leans in and she says, "We've got this boring speaker coming to talk about performance management. Could you come back in here and teach me how to do my hair like that?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to, except I'm the speaker." And so it is that way where it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving, where we always talk about civil service reform, and yet in the original civil service reform, there was a merit pay component which was not viewed very successfully. So we spent the first 8 years of it reforming it to make the performance management and recognition system, which was just for senior managers, the 13s through 15s. It carved up the within grades, and it had a number of the dynamics of things we see today. It sunset after 9 years. You go through a downsizing period in our economy, and you see a movement away from performance-based pay decisions. You have 9/11 come along, and you've got a real focus on bringing in the best and the brightest again, and really ramping up government performance. And you see a big push towards either NSPS, or you see a DSIPS-like system, and a lot of organizations moving towards pay for performance. Maybe not to the base pay, but a lot of times to the bonuses. Now you're seeing a little bit of the ebb of that coming down, and people say, we've even heard at the Chico Council a couple of months ago, "Oh yeah, we tried that didn't work." Well, everything works for a period of time, and then either you learn how to game the system, or you get tired, or there's stagnation. And so recognizing that the workforce has changed, and so the idea you may have tried 10, 15 years ago and didn't have the technology to support it may have a different outcome now. One of the things they found in the private sector, though, is that anytime you raise this concept of changing the performance management system, you increase employee engagement in that workforce. I think the finding was like 90% had indicated that there was a positive outcome whenever you are re-engaging or restarting a performance management system. Some of the things we've seen, in addition to what she talked about earlier with the NGA, but we do see a number of organizations, CIA and NSA in particular. Customs has always been, but they're in a pass-fail system where they want to go more to immediate cash, not at CIA, but at NSA and Customs, they go more to a cash award. A number of organizations looking at team and peer review types of awards. So there are a number of different ways to approach it that don't have to necessarily have the same parameters that what we tried 20 years ago had.
Are there certain models that lend themselves to certain kinds of agencies, or do you see a pattern in what works and doesn't?
That's a good question. I don't think so. One of the concerns I've had in performance management, having been on the front line in DSIPS, was that in the government, we all know people who write policy, and that's what they do. They do it in and out and over again. I mean, what is the phrase? Wash, rinse, and repeat. I mean, we just, do that. We refresh our policy, and then we review it, and then we come back around. Well, one of the concerns I had as a manager is, at what point do you decide that policy is old enough to drive? It's stable. It doesn't need you tending to it. Or when do we say, I can't tell you how many people use that policy. And more we want data or evidence-driven decision-making. And so you've got people who are really good writers who don't know how to quantify what they wrote. And so you're seeing this, and it's one of the things that concerns me in the whole discussion about poor performers. I don't even think sometimes it's a matter of poor performance as maybe irrelevant performance, that the performance is no longer a high priority for the agency, and yet that person's so nice and they've done such a good job all these years, but maybe we don't need that work anymore, but we need for that person to be able to count how many people are using that policy. I even had one woman, we had a very successful program, and I said, well, how many people went out on that program last year? That's not my job. I don't count. And I'm like, well, you're going to need to learn to count. So I think as we are looking at automation and tools, it's important for everyone to stay current in the dialogue of what are the decision makers needing? Do they need to know how many people use this? How much did it cost? One of the things we've done in the Chico Council is created a benchmarking program so that we can baseline, how many HR professionals it takes and how much time of each HR professional's time is spent on staffing or on classifying or on any particular discipline. They've done the benchmarking across CIO, acquisitions, and CFO as well.
And that all sort of goes back to engagement and employees needing to feel like they're a part of the enterprise.
Yes.
And it also speaks to the issue of the performance rating system. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but how do you maintain integrity in a performance rating system? The government has been criticized for many years for inflating performance ratings. I think a lot of organizations struggle with that. So what are your thoughts on creating a system of integrity?
So I have a number of thoughts about that. On the ratings, the longer you stay in a performance system, the tendency is always to inflate the ratings. Many of you may not know, but it is a statute that requires that we are not able to force the ratings. So when people say, well, why can't we just limit it to 10% and get the top rating? Well, that's a prohibition in government that you're not allowed to for those below the executive level. So that's a little bit, because most people don't know that, or a lot of people don't know it, there's a sense that the ratings are being forced when actually they can't be forced. What we also see is 98% of the workforce rated fully successful or above. And yet our own climate survey says that one of the worst ratings we give ourselves is we don't think managers are doing enough about poor performance, and that rate's around 67%. Well, those two facts don't seem to support each other. There must be some people in the fully successful category getting ratings who others may not feel like that work was actually fully successful. So this tendency to inflate the ratings is a natural progression in a performance management system, and it's a good reason why you have these types of innovation funds like the administration, so that you can change it up and change sort of that game that's been going on. There's also a factor that I find in the workplace is I think Harvard coined the term the idiosyncratic rater effect. And this is very true in not just ratings, but also in hiring. And it has to do with when you hire somebody, particularly if you hired someone from the outside and didn't pick the person on the job who's been in the job, you have a need to prove that you hired the right person. And so you will tolerate a certain degree of performance from that person, trying to get them up to speed. And it takes you about 6 to 9 months when that honeymoon finally wears off and you're like, oh my gosh, I made the wrong choice. Same thing happens with ratings. The idiosyncratic rater effect is that the rating has more to do with the rater than it does with the person being rated. All of us have worked on something where you had a new secretary come in who's got some big agenda, and they happen to be in your lane. I know when we were at DOD, when I was at DOD, the last SecDef had come in and was really big on Force of the Future. Well, that was a big human capital initiative, so we were all at the table and it was a big deal. And for a year, we came up with some very innovative ideas. He moves out, someone else moves in, it's no longer a priority. Well, in the rating system, someone who worked on something that was a SecDef priority, that got a higher rating. The next year, you worked just as hard, you did just as much, you did just as, you maybe even worked more overtime, but it wasn't the same priority, and yet our culture assumes that I was a 4.2 last year, I should be a 4.2 this year. Overcoming sort of the past success is one of the challenges, I think, in the whole rating system. And so it does lend itself to the notion of we need to change it up, and we do need to look at things where you're doing things more closely allied with when the performance occurred, recognizing that performance closer to the time they performed it.
One of the things that at Government Executive, we get a lot of comments on pieces we run on performance management, performance rating, and those comments often center on supervisors who the commenters believe are not doing a good job. They're not doing the hard work of managing, and it's very difficult to give people substandard performance reviews. It's difficult psychologically, emotionally. If they push back, there's a whole administrative trail that may go with that. To do that well, you need, I think, training. You also need the support of the broader organization. And I'm wondering how much of a factor that is from your perspective. Are managers and supervisors really equipped to do the hard work of delivering honest performance appraisals?
So this is a trick question. I think that the government has a number of excellent systems that are designed to train their supervisors and to bring them up to speed. But the real, boots on the ground right there on the face of it, the truth is there are a lot of situations where managers got burned once by giving someone, trying to take that hard stand and trying to rate somebody really where they deserve this year. They get a lot of blowback, they get a lot of either reconsiderations or grievances. It only takes one, and then that manager's done, because that manager's not going to they're not going to charge that hill a second time. And I think there's a tendency to want to blame the managers for not making the hard call, because you're sitting there and you're seeing it for the first time, but you may not see that this manager really took it. And one of the issues with that has to do with whether or not they're getting the support from leadership to take those hard stands. I know GAO just came out with a report dealing with employee misconduct. I think it's still in draft, but I know that they touched on a little bit of this issue of dealing with what do you do when managers don't feel like their supervisors are going to back them up when they make that hard call, and it does take management backing them up. So I think we're going to be looking for more best practices to encourage the CHICOs to roll those out in order to empower the managers to take a stronger position on employee accountability.
You mentioned, with regard to an earlier question, how the workforce is changing, the workforce dynamic. And you had mentioned earlier, younger workers often have different expectations from older workers. They want more feedback and more interaction. How can supervisors and managers respond to this dynamic within their organizations effectively?
It is, and this is just a personal observation. I'm watching the Oscars the other night, and Jennifer Lawrence comes out with Jodie Foster, and there's a big height differential, and my husband goes, well, how tall is Jennifer Lawrence? And so I look it up really fast, and, Jodie Foster is 5'3", in case anyone wants to know. A little while later, or a little bit later, well, how old is Faye Dunaway? And I look it up, and, boom, I know it right then. Well, for people who've grown up with information always being available right like that, the idea that you've got to wait a year to get an assessment of how your performance was is just foreign. It's just not something that they're familiar with. All right, break. Let's talk about the traditionalist or the baby boomer or the Gen Xer who is used to avoiding conflict, trying to manage that workforce. And the idea of continuous feedback has a little bit different perspective in terms of, if I'm having to give this person this much feedback, that's not a positive. And so we always use continuous feedback, and this is a really positive, they need more praise. Well, sometimes the feedback isn't always praise. And so trying to balance the generational approaches to the workforce and performance management is a big challenge. And I think it really, reading up on current philosophy and moving forward with some ways to empower the managers to overcome both their own generational issues as to how they see continuous feedback, but to also give genuine feedback that will help the employee master their trade craft.
We are going to open this up for questions soon, so get your questions ready.
I'm not giving any pointers on how I did my hair. Just telling you.
So the success of any workforce reforms, of course, depend on the capabilities and abilities of the workforce itself. And that often comes down to training and communication. But at a time when many agencies are under tremendous fiscal constraints, training is often the first thing to go. What do you see in terms of prioritizing training, given the scope and challenge of the reforms anticipated?
So I would anticipate with this innovation fund that, the workforce fund, that we're going to see training is stitched into the fabric of how we're going to move forward, because there's a big focus on the reskilling, the upskilling, the fact that we want to move some employees over into areas where we have a bigger demand signals, such as IT and cyber-related areas. And so while that might have traditionally been the way we treated training in the past, I believe that the time has come that we're going to see a big push towards an emphasis in training and development, and that those are going to be mission-centric, agency-specific.
And you believe that because of what you're hearing from?
I do. I've seen it in several documents where the proposals have come forward, where we're talking about continuous learning and looking at how we reskill and repurpose the workforce. Well, those are words for training and development.
Okay. Do we have questions?
Billy Lazarson, BL Insights. One of the things that I've heard a lot about today is pay for performance, and that seems to be looked at as an incentive for getting better performance out of people. But I also wonder whether that seems to me just it's kind of like paying for grades with your kids, or kind of what you really want is your employees and your managers to be motivated by connecting to the mission.
Right.
And the pay for performance is really a recognition. It's like an extra form of, a special form of recognition. Another one is your performance evaluation and getting that, promotions and other things like that. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you think that we're really capturing those things, and is there a risk in pay for performance kind of taking over the whole sphere here, if that makes any sense.
So I had this conversation about pay for performance, because in the human capital realm, pay for performance normally refers to base pay adjustments. When we're talking performance management, or you're talking performance incentives, you're dealing more with one-time cash award, a bonus, whether it's tied to a year or a specific spot award. I believe that right now we're looking less towards base pay adjustments and more towards bonuses. Whether or not that is an incentive will really depend on how well we distribute it. If we really make it special to individuals, or is it something we try to peanut butter spread? A lot of those lessons learned from the past are things we're going to have to take forward of, are you really just divvying it out, trying to even the score for everybody because, we didn't get a pay raise? Are you really using it for a performance indicator? Or is this, compensation for, well, so-and-so was absent for a week or two and you had to pick up stuff. Well, that's life in the workplace. So I think that anytime you're putting an emphasis on performance management, particularly focusing the supervisors and getting employee peer review, that's going to be a positive. How long you can sustain it, or whether or not you can do things to correct it along the way. Don't just keep working with a system that's just aggravating the employees.
Do you have any? Yes.
Thank you. A moment ago, you mentioned embedding training as part of supporting performance management. Can you also share your thoughts on the role of coaching in performance management to support it, and whether that's internal providers, external providers, or managers and leaders using coaching skills?
Oh, I totally love this question. And I'm sorry it's the last question. In my opinion, coaching is a critical piece to all of this. And I used to always say my daddy used to interview, I grew up on a family newspaper, and he interviewed a local senator, and the senator, somebody had asked him how he got into politics, and he said, well, don't sit around waiting for somebody to encourage you to run for office, because you will never hold political office if you're waiting for someone to encourage you to do it. You got to take it yourself and go do it. And I see that about coaching as well, is that a lot of times people are counting on their boss to help move them up, but it's not in the boss's interest to move you up. It's in the boss's interest to keep you there performing well so that they look good. So coaching, particularly somebody outside of your organization, helping you take the bull by the horns and do what's necessary for your career, because there really is no one else looking after your career. And so that coaching piece is it's a valuable one. It's one that even if the government isn't offering it, it's something people should be looking at, either from possibly from private sector. But in the government, there's the frustration on succession planning. And you do have some organizations that are rank in person where they have a natural sort of conveyor belt of where they're taking you in your career. But that's not that many. I mean, those tend to be in the intelligence organizations. This frustration of not feeling like you have the opportunity, or that no one's moving you there, it's just one where individuals need to take the personal ambition and move that to their benefit.
I'd like to wrap up with a question on the role of human capital officers. In the private sector, human capital officers are really strategic players. They're integral to the mission and forward-looking organizations, at least. And in government, I'm not sure that's always the case, and I'm wondering if you see a shift in government from a role that is often perceived as very transactional, hiring, removing people, the processes involved, which are very complex. But do you see a shift to something that's more strategic and developing the workforce that's needed in a rapidly changing environment, and how do you facilitate that? So
I agree that there is a conflict between those two. And it is one that we as the Chico Council are trying to help OPM with, but also help ourselves with, and that has to do with this bifurcation between human capital being about strategic workforce planning, where are we going as an agency, how do we get our mission done, and being a partnership with the mission managers to achieve similar goals. There is the aptitude, though, to default to human resource work, and that is the transactional. I know I sat in one Chico Council at DOD where we sat and debated how many boxes there needed to be on the telework form. That's not exactly very strategic planning. However, I do know, I had heard this moniker the other day, was culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so a lot of times we'll come in with strategy of how we're going to do things different in human capital, but you've got to overcome that inertia of the thing I know and the thing I'm good at and the thing I have, the systems I've got. You tend to default to those. And when we default to those in the human capital area, we lose a voice at the table because the mission managers just don't have the time for that. They want to have, how do I get these people? How do I get them on quickly? How do I get the skills that I want? How do I get the quality employee? Don't tell me about, Schedule A authority or direct hire. Don't tell me all the mechanisms you're going to use. Just get it done. And so that's where we need to really move the paradigm of conversation in the human capital world to keep us at the level where we are having an influence on the direction that a mission is taking, rather than, giving them an HR response.
Well, thank you. Seems like a good place to wrap it up. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thanks.